started. We're trying to get one of our panelists on. Of course, it wouldn't be a typical Zoom event if there wasn't some type of technical thing. Can you guys see Tracy?
Oh, Tracy's on, yes.
There
she's
it is.
on.
Great.
She's
It
on.
wasn't
Yeah.
showing that
Yeah.
she was there. Great. Well, hi, everybody. I'm Amanda Forys. I'm the managing partner here at Magnolia Market Access. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is our March 2026 event. Every month we do this, the fourth Thursday of the month. We call it Navigating Market Access with Magnolia. And we try to bring interesting topics so you. We to not be salesy. The point is for you to come and learn. I will say today's has kind of a case study approach just because this is something that we've been working on with a lot of clients. And as we've been doing these types of projects, it's been evolving into a bigger and bigger project, as you're going to see. So we wanted to talk a little bit today about ecosystem mapping, what it means, what you do with it, how it's kind of a cross-functional organizational process. So really excited to dive in. I'm going to let each of us introduce ourselves. So as I said, I'm Amanda Forys. So my focus is mostly market access, policy, pricing, and reimbursement is kind of my background. So we'll be talking about quite a few things from the policy perspective today. And in order of appearance, next is Andrea. Andrea, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, absolutely. So welcome everybody again, as Amanda was saying, to the webinar today. I'm Andrea Schatz-Anderer, EVP Strategy and Insights at the data analytics arm of Magnolia Market Access called 81QD. Looking forward to the seminar today and to this webinar today. And I'm joined by my colleague, Susan.
Thanks, Andrea. Welcome, everyone. Looking forward to the discussion. Susan Abady, Chief Strategy Officer with an 81QD and Medical Knowledge Group, our network company. And handing it over to Tracy.
Good afternoon, everybody. Tracy Barani-Allman, VP of Health Policy and Market Access at Magnolia Market Access, here to chime in as appropriate today.
Thank you. And yeah, so I should have added. So we have met at a Magnolia Market Access. Our firm is kind of small but mighty. We're about a 15-person boutique practice. We're part of a broader organization called Medical Knowledge Group, and we work closely with one of our sister companies, 81QD. So we wanted them to join today to really talk about these types of projects. We do collaborate on this, as you'll see, the data-heavy approach. They have a very, very strong analytics team, and then we kind of work with them to build out what we want to do with the analyses, and then also what to do with it and some of the tactical execution. So appreciate them joining us today. All right. Also, we will be at Assembia. So I actually somehow in my entire career have avoided going to Las Vegas for Assembia. I have no clue how, but this year I have decided I am in it. So would love to see people there. We do have some things on LinkedIn, and we'll be sending out some more information if you'd like to meet. Hoping to see everyone, and yeah, it'll be exhausting, I'm sure, but it will be a great time. So hoping to see people there. Okay, so the first thing we want to talk about today is what is ecosystem mapping? So what's the concept of it? I'm sure you've heard all sorts of different things of thought leader identification, payer segmentation, all these words that we talk about in different deliverables that you may have seen at your organization. I want to take a step bigger today and talk about how all of that can come together. We do it analytically, but also using AI now and different tools that are out there to make some of the processes smoother and what we can do with the information easier, faster. So what is ecosystem mapping? What do we do manually? What do we think about as a group? How can we use all those tools together? How do you do it successfully? And then what do you do with it? I think a lot of times, and in my pharma world, we've done a lot of projects where we'll hand clients something of here's a map, here's an idea, and then it's great, and then we just sit on it and we don't do anything with it, right? So how do you actually make this type of exercise meaningful across your entire organization? So let's dive in. So I'll kind of talk about the first piece of it. So what is ecosystem mapping? So the biggest thing to me when we were kind of setting up Magnolia Market Access and what we really wanted to drive home to our clients is To us, market access includes a lot of people. I think some people think more payer. Some people on the market access world think patient, right? We think way bigger. We're thinking payer, patient, policymaker, your medical affairs team and their role in market access, real world evidence, all those different things that come together to promote access. And all of the people on this wheel are kind of players in that ecosystem. So if you think about it, as I mentioned, Tracy and I both, we do a lot of policy work. So we work with a lot of pharma policy teams, helping them figure out, okay, we're having a coverage issue with X, or we're having challenges with Y. What should we do? And we're helping them say, okay, this is how you could go out, gain support, bring in people into your circle and work with different organizations to achieve your legislative or regulatory goals. Or we'll have a lot of our clients come to us of, we have a new product launching. We need to figure out the payer landscape. What can we do with that? Well, let's go look at who's covering products, what we think could happen in terms of coverage and rebate considerations that you might see as you're trying to get your product evaluated or contracted. Not only is it the payer, but who are all the people influencing the payer? What do they have to do with covering and pushing for coverage for your product? And how should you interact with them? But then, as I just said, those two things, all of a sudden you see that marry, because not only do you have to think about the payer themselves, but what about that specialty society or that trade association or that group that can influence all of that? So should you at the organizational level be working just as much with your policy team as you are within your brand market access team? So the web gets very, very thick, very, very quickly. And I would say I get more excited talking about all the intricacies than like my daughter does when she's 12 and I take her to Starbucks, right? Like it's a very exciting concept to think about, of just what can you do at the pharma level instead of just, being, sometimes we keep our head down in our brand, to think about all of those interactions. What should your medical affairs team be thinking about in their patient advocacy work, as well as your policy team and their patient advocacy work, right? Like, how do those things intersect? How are they different? So we want to think about not just the arrows into access, but all of the interconnectivities between all of these people. So we literally want to build out a huge web that says, who are all these people? How are they related? How do we want to interact with them? And who should be doing that? So I think this is where you have to think a little bit broader across an organization, and this can be difficult for larger pharma companies, right? But I see more and more of our clients that have tended to work in these silos, not able to do that as much, that they usually have those, of course you have to have certain firewalls, right, by law, but there are some places where those firewalls are starting to have to come down a little bit because the world's changing, the way we're thinking about access is changing. So in those cases, everybody in a pharma company, from the salesperson who's talking to the physician, to the person in the clinical room working at R&D, all of us are thinking about access, right? That's our goal. We all want to get a patient something to help with their condition, to either cure it or treat it. So to do that, we all have a different role and responsibility, and we have to come together to set up goals, set up a process of how, again, we're going to work within these different stakeholders to come up with a solution. So I want to remind everybody that, across pharma, we say the right stakeholder, engaging with them at the right time, and then also putting the right information in front of them. This also ties into every single webinar where we always remind our clients that we, the market access and the policy people, we're the most important people at pharma, right? Because our job is to push from all that amazing medication, all those amazing conversations you've had with the physician, to get the payer to cover it and get it to the patient. So if that doesn't happen, everything that's gone before, what was the point, right? So that's what we want to do, is help push those conversations across your whole organization to promote access. So when you do this, you kind of have to have a 4-step process. And I put a big red box around steps 1 and 2, because I think this is where a lot of these things can kind of die, right? You have to first get everyone at your organization that's going to be involved in the map to come together and say, who are our stakeholders that we want to think about that are important to us? Then we want to say, how should we interact with these organizations? How do we identify who the important people are? And then what do we do with that information? So once we have that information, I'm going to go back to this web for a second. Once we know who the important HCPs and staff members are, or we know how to better engage with them based on specific characteristics, what is the sales team going to take to that provider versus what is my FRM going to take in a discussion, or what should my hub be doing to work with that, or what should my SP be doing to work with that office staff. So you need to sit down and really map out, obviously, our traditional roles and responsibilities, but even some of the, less traditional roles and responsibilities are important to think about as well. So, for example, academic influencers, I think, is a great example. We have a lot of people in academia. There's a lot of centers that do really interesting research studies that come out. They're important. They're influencing decisions on the Hill. They are influencing decisions payers make for coverage. Specialty societies are influencing guidelines, clinical guidelines that payers consider. Who should be interacting with them? Should it be your policy team at a certain level? Should your sales team be involved, or your sales organization, your brand organization and marketing? Or should market access be involved with these people, or your medical affairs team? There's different people at those organizations that you should all be thinking about your interactions a little bit differently. So each one of these groups blasts into, a million subgroups, and sitting down and saying, this is what we want to know about them, and here's what we're going to do for that interaction up front is very important. So it's really sitting down and doing a workshop and managing that process. And then setting through the tactical, right? So we're going to talk about the how we get to those people. And then after that, how do you tactically execute that information you want to share, driving that goal that you're shooting towards to those people, and each of those people through your various teams and outlets. So I think step 1 and 2 can be really, really challenging because it requires a lot of pre-planning. But I think those are, again, the most important steps to make sure that once you get to what Andrea and Susan are going to talk about, the actual ecosystem mapping, and then the execution of it, which Tracy's going to talk about, what do we do with it? You have all of that defined, you know where you might have to pivot, you've kind of planned for those things, and you're ready to come once you have the work done and roll out with your actual tactics. So that is my little intro to this. And again, very exciting to talk about it. We're going to give you now like an approach to how we think about ecosystem mapping. And we're going to give some examples throughout that just show like different ways or different people on our wheel that we've thought about with the ecosystem mapping. I'm also going to put in, we have the Q&A open. So if anyone does have any questions that they want to put in, please do not hesitate to ask throughout. We're happy to address some questions. And I might already have one. Okay. Oh, this is a good question. Someone said, does this wheel and ecosystem look materially different between therapeutics versus med tech and diagnostics? That is a really great question. I don't think so. I think you might have a different person at a payer that you might have to talk to depending on your product. But I do a lot of work in pharma. I also do a lot of work in organ transplantation. And I do work with a ton of different companies that have a lot of different products in transplantation. And I think of their wheel exactly the same. Maybe on their like regulator side, I might think a little bit about HRSA, maybe more because they're managing OPTN and all of those things. Or I might think a little bit different about the specialty societies that they engage with. But I think it's really one and the same. I will say, though, I don't think these wheels are like a one size fits all. And actually, everything we think about when we do this, and again, not trying to sound salesy, but when we do those workshops with people and say, who are your stakeholders? We do get very specific because every brand, every type of product, every disease area is going to be a little different, right? Like oncology is going to have a very, very strong like NCCN, right? You might have a stronger guideline body in oncology than you might have in other disease areas. You may have research organizations or patient groups like the ESRD community. They are a very vocal patient group. They may have more power or more influence of what's going on in the world for coverage or in policy than other organizations. So I think it'll maybe be a little different or different weights, but I think the general, like kind of the big overarching of the who shouldn't vary by person or by a product or if it's therapeutic or diagnostic. Okay, great. Thank you for the question. All right, so I will turn it over to Andrea.
Thanks so much, Amanda. So very quickly now that Amanda has basically introduced the wheel in the middle, here's the approach that we are taking to ecosystem mapping. And again, it varies exactly what we're doing between disease states, etc. But we always follow this framework. So the framework remains the same. but what we're looking at eventually and how we're engaging is different. So we first start out with identifying. Again, we want to make sure, whom are we looking for? Are we looking for people participating in clinical trials? Are we looking for somebody who is influencing policy? Are we looking for your typical KOLs? What exactly are we doing? We're then also not just looking at like, who is making a name for themselves because they're somewhere in the ecosystem, but we're also looking at like, how are they connected? How many people are following them? How many people are they influencing also through potentially, clinical decision making? Ultimately, we're assessing them and saying like, okay, how much influence do they have? Can we measure the influence? And then from there, we're profiling a core set to eventually execute with. So the other way I always like to describe this is think of it as a funnel, right? We're starting out very, very broad with any and all potential stakeholders that we could have any interest in. And then we start narrowing it down one step at a time until we have at the end the absolute right stakeholders for the different teams to engage with. How we do this, let's just go to the next slide if you don't mind, is we ask, these are a couple of the sources that we're using, and these are the questions we ask. So we're like looking at like, who's publishing on the topic that we're interested in, or publishing any industry reports. We're also looking at editorial boards. Who is on these editorial boards? If you're planning on publishing something, important to know. We're looking at social media and online presence. Online presence very often are more your typical KOLs, key opinion leaders, etc. But we also look at social media, and we're not just looking at like, oh, great, somebody is posting and has a lot of followers. We want to make sure it's relevant to the topic of interest. And we're looking at like, do they have the right followers? Our associations, advocacy groups that Amanda mentioned, following them as well. We're looking at association leadership as well. Who is in the association? Because again, they can influence also guidelines and so forth. We're working on projects where we're looking at congressional hearings and task forces. Who is influencing how policy which policy is being written, etc. And who are the right legislators? Also, who are part of think tanks? We're looking at like clinical trial participation. Who is participating? In some cases, we're even looking at like who actually would have the right patients to even be in the clinical trial. And one of the reasons we also look at clinical trial participation, if somebody is in a clinical trial as an investigator, they have very early experience with this particular drug. So that's important to know as well. Obviously, we're also looking at payers, and we're not looking necessarily who's employed by the payer, but we're looking at like, whom are the payers consulting with? We did primary market research to talk to payers. We had small plans and large plans. And we said, are you going to the outside? Are you going to experts? Whom are you talking to? And yes, they all confirmed, yes, we have experts in-house, but we're going externally as well, because we want to know what the impact is if we put something else on formulary, etc. And so that is something else we look at. We obviously look at conference speaking. Who has a large megaphone out there? Whom is everybody flocking to see at a conference, etc. Guideline authorship, we already mentioned that, but who's on those guidelines? And then also direct patient engagement. Are there any advocacy groups out there? Is anybody, in advocacy groups, as we're going to see in an example a little bit later, have a lot of influence because they are also going in front of the FDA and pleading their case at times. So we're looking at all of this and we're pulling all of that information together, and we start to identify the right stakeholders. But again, different emphasis is given by different stakeholders within your organization. So we also, everything that we do, you have input as the various stakeholders in an organization, you will have input into that. What I'm saying with that is like, we do everything bespoke. So we're not just pushing a button and saying like one size fits all, and Amanda already alluded to that. But we're saying like, okay, what do you need and what is right for a particular brand? what is right for a particular product, what is right in a disease state. And the methodology that we deploy is adjusted accordingly, but it always falls within the framework that I just outlined on the previous slide. Once we're done with that, as you will see on the next slide, we narrow it down. So we mine everything. And again, think of it as a funnel. We mine everything. We pull all the individuals together. And then we're looking like, okay, who fits into how many different categories, buckets, and so forth. And we start assessing and evaluating individuals. We're saying, okay, who meets most of those criteria? And those are definitely like, and then you have, individuals who maybe only on one editorial board. We're like, yeah, not really relevant for what we're trying to accomplish here. Or maybe somebody is on a guideline, very important, but doesn't influence directly a payer, but that may be fine. So again, we're categorizing everything, pulling it all together, and then we're analyzing it and bringing it further down as we go down in the funnel. And just to show you how different the sources can be, I'm going to give you like one example on the next slide. There we go. This is just example out of policy. It's like where we're like, let's look at stakeholder leadership, membership, everything from, Academy of Managed Care Pharmacy down to pharma, down to Community Oncology Alliance, et cetera, et cetera. But we were also looking, in this particular case, we were also looking at congressional hearings and task forces. But again, they have to be relevant for what you as an organization are trying to accomplish. And then we also look at policy foundations, think tanks. So anything that's in the public domain is what we're pulling together to identify the right stakeholders for you and for the different teams.
Great. And yeah, I
And
think this is
yeah.
When Tracy, I know we, in doing some of this work with like thinking about who's influencing policy, what do you think have been some of like the lessons learned on this spot here? I know with you have a big background in oncology, and we've looked at other areas. We've been through these exercises.
I think there's a lot to be learned every time we do this. And if you've seen one issue and developed the path, you've seen one issue and developed the path. There are obviously several more congressional caucuses, rare disease, personalized medicine, women's health issues. So thinking that, there's a clear marker where we should go. We should go to these academics and these think tanks, I think really limits us and gets us into a spot where the industry was in like the early 2000s, where an economist named Uwe Reinhardt did a lot of writing on international pricing and why that wasn't right for the US. But it became so common to see his name affiliated with industry positions that it wasn't really worth it. And yet we know that there are a lot of people who understand the intricacies of some of the really major policy issues of today, from international pricing to 340B to what is the impact of delayed access on outcomes or lack of insurance on outcomes, and who bears the weight for that. I think really looking deeper and finding like the new people within Heritage Foundation who are looking to make a name for themselves, getting out there, talking to them, finding out what the APHA, the American Pharmacists Association, is working on with their PharmD interns. Is there an opportunity there? So digging deeper is important, and not being afraid to go off the beaten path.
Yeah, I agree with that. One of the things too, I know we've been in touch with a lot of our clients lately on how like the Congressional Budget Office, for example, they put out hey, we need more research. We need people to send us more data. They're probably seeing a lot of the stuff that's been out there for a long time. They're relying on a lot of the same information. So you do an exercise like this, you kind of learn who's saying what, who's got what out there, and then your teams can also kind of backfeed that information to agencies that are making decisions at the policy level. So I definitely think like on the policy influencer side, it's important. And then also like you look at some of this list and you've got some of these like pharmacy associations, you get into some of the specialty societies and those groups too, which I know we didn't put them on here. This would have been like a huge slide, right? We've had 87 slides of examples, but now you get into specialty societies and you think, how do you, from a policy influential side, think about a specialty society, but also from the guideline side, from the HCP decision-making side, right? It all just grows and grows into, again, more of those connectivities between those groups of people. So thanks.
And I think the point that Tracy was making as well is it's really important to not just find established KOLs and established people that everybody knows and almost validating, what everybody is pretty much and the people everybody is aware of, but uncovering new individuals, up and comers, and also saying like, who's a rising star? Whom do we potentially want to engage with early on so that they understand our position? We can educate them early on, etc. So I think that was a very valid point that Tracy was making there as well.
Yeah, very good point. That was actually when we started our company too. We were thinking about like, we put these like market access basics on our website. We're like, there's so many people that are like getting going in their career, trying to figure things out. And I remember when I used to work for someone who'd be like, oh, back in 1989, and he'd like pull that regulation and go to the page. And I was like, oh my gosh, it's 2006. I don't know any of this stuff, right? And we've all kind of built up this knowledge. It's like, yeah, we've now got people coming in, learning it, and becoming the new leaders, and completely agree. It's working with them, and the up and comers are very important. So absolutely.
I think it goes to the next piece we're going to talk about, which is really those connections. I mean, you talked about connectivity. So those up and comers are normally working also probably with an established person. So let's map those connections and understand who's that thought leader who's also working with those up and comers. So we go to that next piece. Really, that next stage is that mapping. We call this ecosystem mapping, and it's because both of those terms are important. That ecosystem, the range of different influencers within that market access landscape, but also that mapping piece. And what we'll lay out here is how we do that and show some examples of that mapping. The key thing here, as Andrea noted, is influence. When we think about influence, we often think about our own type of influence in terms of, well, I looked at something on Instagram, or I'm, a thought leader, let's say we know speaking on a podium, and we're thinking about their influence for the people that are attending, but recognizing that influencers also influence each other. People are connected. And what we do in this mapping phase is understand those connections. Who publishes together, who speaks together at a conference, who sits on an association together that Andrea had, all those different associations that Andrea had laid out, who actually sits on that leadership team together and is influenced by each other in terms of as they're talking through their issues. And then also socially, I mean, social media, LinkedIn, we know that all of us are probably also on LinkedIn watching our friends and our colleagues, what they're doing, but we're following that. We're influenced by what we see. So who's connected to each other on LinkedIn or social media, things like X, who's following each other on X. So in this mapping phase, we are doing that mapping, really laying out that interconnectivity between our the influencers to understand that web, so that we can also think about how we engage. And in the next slide, we have an example of this, again, taken from the policy world, somebody that I think probably 80% of people on this call, no matter whether you were a young, earlier rising star or more established, I've probably heard of this person from a policy world. He was one of my old professors, so I'm excited to see him on this slide. But he's an influencer, but he's also connected to a number of different people. And so the value here is understanding those connections. And some of those people can be up and comers. And you can see what we do when we do that mapping is we look at those publications. So who does he publish with? Who does he follow on social media? Who follows him on social media? Who does he sit in associations with? And each of those icons are part of that influence mapping. They're the type of influence. And then we score that level of influence and understand who has a higher level of connectivity with the target, and understanding how can we engage on that. Sometimes there may be a case where the core influencer, the person we're trying to engage with, may not be open to working with us for whatever reason. But the people within his or her network, his web, may be more open. But you have to understand that web. Or we're thinking about things like advocacy. Maybe somebody is actually not an advocate who's an influencer, but people that they're connected to, maybe more of an advocate. So being able to understand that connectivity also allows you to develop different engagement approaches are based on that level of connectivity.
So this
I think the other, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, Tracy.
I think the other thing to think about whenever we look at these connections is that all of these people on this slide, and this is only a few of them, right? Peter Newman's pretty well known and has a lot of connections, but they're not all thinking the same about the issues that Peter Newman focuses on, and they're not thinking the same as each other. So just because you might have heard Joshua Cohen speak at one event, or you know that there were issues that you cared about that he thought differently, doesn't mean that that's going to be his position on every issue compared to your position. And so really thinking about how you go outside the box, outside the normal people, outside the we just want to give a message to a patient group or a message to a provider and ask them to deliver it, thinking about the projects that could really drive that discussion and thinking about what literature is out there that these people may have supported or may not have supported. And of course, this is all much easier now with LinkedIn and other social media, but not every straight line is a straight line, right? Some of them are dotted, some of them are squiggly, and taking advantage of the squiggles and the dots can sometimes be a really huge opportunity.
Absolutely. And just like the breadth of people, like when you read each of these, you've got someone making NCD decisions, right? You've got her helping with the National Coverage Decision Database. You have people working in global health and all the different ICER and everything. It's such a mess. I was calling this slide the 6 degrees of Peter Newman. It's like way more interesting than the bacon one, but no, it definitely shows the interconnectivities. Do you think, I go in and out on like the academia thing of like where would we think of these people influencing? Can you guys give some examples too of like even beyond like policy, how much do you think they're influencing payers? Or we can do all of that, right? We just go and build the map out to the map of here they are with each other. And then Dan, for example, what payers he's engaged with, what providers, right? We just keep building it out. That's what it kind of looks like in the end, correct?
Exactly. I think you're right. It almost becomes the broader web. But to your point, I mean, some of these people may be payer advising influencers. Some of these people may be influencers within the policy world, but also the patient advocacy world. Some of those connections, and to the point of, this is just the 6 degrees. If you go even broader, when particularly something like Peter Newman, you have HCPs that are treaters and they're influencing also the treatment approach, and they're leaders within their institutions and IDNs. So that level of influence, that connectivity is important, but how they're influencing, who are all the dots in that web, that could vary quite very broadly. And that also will shape the engagement strategy that you're looking to connect. Okay. So this is an example in terms of how to think of that influence. As we think about the next slide, and really that piece of really assessing. So now we understand, and it gets to Amanda, to your point around, how are people influencing. Let's also understand that level of influence and the area of focus. And so the next step, having mapped that web, we're looking at the stakeholders we've identified. We're looking at the people that are based on their connectivity and understanding what is that level of influence. How can we quantify it? And there's always the challenge with this. There's always that qualitative piece that says, well, I know this person's top, and I know this person's incredibly influential in this area because of the way I've seen him on the podium, or I've read her articles. But let's also think about how do we quantify so that when we think about prioritizing engagement approaches, we're able to do that. And so these are some examples of what we can look at when we look at that quantification. Some are more academic, particularly for something like a policy influencer, and some are broader when we're looking at institutional influence. There's digital presence. If I may be publishing, but we also know that it's incredibly important in today's world. If I'm on X, if I'm on LinkedIn, am I influencing a broader group of stakeholders, actually, beyond those that are willing to, read my paper? Tracy was mentioning stakeholders that people continue to repeat now and years afterwards. But there are also people that are, online, that are social media influencers, really in the policy world or even in this institutional world. We've seen leaders within IDNs and institutions that are going to conferences, they're speaking about how they're defining their protocols, and the other institution leaders, the other CMOs, the other CFOs are listening and thinking about how does that impact when I go back home to my institution, to my hospital. So that digital presence, that speaking at conferences, again, things if you're more on the congressional policy side, maybe it's speaking actually at congressional meetings, but really capturing that level of influence in a quantifiable way. There's always going to be the qualitative, but really being able to compare so people can prioritize how to engage. And then the next piece is that area of focus. So within that level of, within their network, within their spider web, where are they more focused, and being able to, again, to prioritize to support engagement. On the next slide, we go deeper really into that assess piece, and just an example again, because we want to make sure that it's real to everybody. So this is an example really taking from the sickle cell world, where you can see that level of looking at different patient advocacy leadership and looking and mapping across different institutions and different advocacy. So here, this slide has a group of patient advocacy leadership across the U.S. as well as international, and you can, and the key thing is, particularly in diseases where you have that significant unmet need, we know that patient advocacy has a significant impact on that broader ecosystem, from an access perspective, from a regulatory perspective, and really and obviously from a treatment perspective. So understanding those leaders within those institutions and associations are incredibly important. They shape the access, they shape policy, they drive that clinical trial awareness, and really support really the media attention. And so one of the ways we can assess that level of influence is understanding who's involved in these, and also which groups also have the most influence, whether that may be more domestic or global, but that really allows us to develop that engagement strategy as well. So it ensures that we're reaching those right stakeholders with the right channels.
I just had a question come in, and I think it speaks a little bit to the slide, like you've highlighted some outside, like ex-US groups. How do you think about mapping like internationally versus like US, or looking within like EU or Canada? Like, do you ever do cross country, or do you generally work within country?
So I can answer. Oh, Andrew, go ahead.
Yeah.
Actually.
No, absolutely. We can do it, country specific, but also truly globally, right? And it's actually interesting also then the measurement, because sometimes it's like we're doing mapping exercises, let's say in Europe, and then you can say like, okay, is somebody influencing only their country, or are they influencing the rest of Europe as well? How many connections do they have to other individuals? Do they come to the US and speak at conferences? Do they go to European congresses, or is it very, very domestic? So we measure that as well, but we there look, again, follow exactly the same framework, just then structure it slightly differently by going either very, very deep in one country or going cross country and truly making it globally or regionally. In that case, region meaning Europe, right?
Okay, thanks. I had one other question come in. Sorry, I'm going back
Great.
up a couple slides. So when we talked about like how we rate people's level of influence or different things that they're doing in their different activity, how do you weight these things? Like, do you set weights? Is that kind of
Yes.
you work on it as you go? How do you do that?
And so what we have weights that we've pulled together, just based on experience in terms of what we think of as a level of connectivity. So for example, if I'm presenting at a conference with you and we co-presented a presentation, we work together on that, that's different from, let's say, I'm presenting within a session, a broader session. I have one session and you have another session, but it's within a whole group, group. So we look at the differences, and we weight those as well. And we'll set those differences. But the other part is we'll look at what matters for the team. Also, how are we looking to engage? So for a good example is things like publications. If I did this together with you, or let's say I'm on a clinical trial publication, which really means that you and I, we're all PIs, but we're across the world, across the country, right? But we're not really working together on that publication. So we're going to that nuance and breaking it up, but at the same time taking a step back and really understanding, is this level of connection driving that level of influence, but also based on our use case, based on our client's use case, how we want to engage, what makes sense from that weighting. Okay.
Great, thank you. All right, awesome. Okay, I'll hop on to the next slide.
And this, again, for more just giving deeper in that example, just making sure that that everyone here has a sense of the reality of what we're doing. This is another example within that assess space. Really, again, focus on that patient advocacy, and what you see are these examples, real examples of advocacy associations that operate within that ecosystem. From you see foundation websites, patient education materials. The key thing is these groups are not passive observers. They're shaping the conversation about treatment and access. And this is the kind of evidence that we would look at to understand that impact, right? And so as you can see for the some of the examples, research advocacy pays off with FDA action that will save lives, right? That's direct impact on the clinical trials and on clinical, approval, right? And then you will see things like the sickle cell patient-led listening sessions. Again, impact on that clinical development cycle, impact on the clinical development approaches as well, and the impact on policy. So where we're looking at this assess phase, we're also saying who are the most influential of patient advocacy groups in terms of, are they actually engaging in those ways? Are they having that impact? And where is that impact? Is that more on the clinical side? Is that more on the regulatory side? Is that more on the treatment side? Is it more on the payer side? So also understanding where that impact is.
Thank you.
And then, that's next phase where we've identified the stakeholders, we've mapped their connections, we've assessed that level of influence. Where is that influence? How much? Which associations or groups are most influential? Now let's build a profile so that it again could be user friendly for our clients. So these are some examples of things that we pulled together in a profile, really outlining who the people are, and some examples when we think about payer advising leaders. So these are two examples. One from and I think the question was, do we do this ex-US? Do we do it globally as well as in the US? And this is a great example of a German example from a payer advising influencer, and a US example as an advisor to CVS Caremark. So in that profiling pace, we're really identifying who are the people, understanding their background, their history, their affiliations, as well as what are the organizations they specifically influence. For here, CVS or the German IQWiG. So it really allows you to pull it all together so that you leave with all the analysis, but the ability to actually engage and develop a direct engagement approach that's practical. And Tracy's going to really get into, how do you do that? How do you take all this information and make magic?
Yeah, and I think, Tracy, we've lived this, right? With we finishing this and then helping them. What do we do with the information? Because it's a lot of information, right? And we've got, as we talked about before, it's getting the roles and responsibilities for each team, what they're going to do with the information. You're kind of building out what you're expecting it to look like, and then where do you go from there? So would love you to share your thoughts, Tracy.
I do think that if you've seen one of these, you've seen one of these, and even sometimes your predefined goals of engagement change, right? So you do have to have buy-in. You do have to understand everybody has a role, but then you also need to be flexible to understand more about who is out there willing to work with you, what is out there. And then, of course, as you're pulling all this together, because we all know that none of this happens as quickly as anybody wants it to, things change, right? There might be a paper released, or there might be a congressional hearing, things that might shift how you want to look at the issue. So it's still important to you, but maybe your strategy is going to slightly shift, whether it's around prioritization of members of Congress who might have brought in witnesses for a particular hearing, or whether it's around patient groups that have now engaged in this. So make sure that you leave room for that type of flexibility. Development of materials and strategies. This is a lot about how you can work with others who may or may not be open to working with the industry, right? And really thinking about what the common goals would be. Like it or not, there are a lot of academicians who now may be willing to work on issues with the industry that were of interest to them before, but now they need more funding than they did before because of changes in budgets and priorities. So while they might not have been exactly aligned with the industry, they may be willing to work with you on something around prior authorization and the impacts of that in health outcomes, because they are, after all, public health researchers, and this is something that matters to them. And so looking Their interest in finding different funding can align with your interest in identifying different people to develop and carry your message. Executing based on the predetermined roles and responsibilities is absolutely important, and making sure that your internal team is aligned. So the flexibility that I spoke of above can't be crazy willy-nilly flexibility. It has to be discussed and recognized why you're switching, why you're shifting, why your shape isn't exactly a circle anymore, why you're letting more people in, or why you're thinking differently about an issue. But the idea of roles and responsibilities internally, and also who relates and talks to and has that stakeholder relationship. It doesn't just have to be one person, but it can't be 17 people, because at that point people don't want to work with you anymore because it's just crazy. Um, Identifying your metrics for success is important, and understanding where you're going to go with this. But the reality is that as you develop a project, as you think through a strategy, the changes in the environment, maybe the changes in your product profile, the changes in the competitive market that maybe you were foreseeing, maybe you missed, could allow this to shift as well. But understanding, again, why it shifted, is the timeline still the same? Are we still interested in this? And that almost goes back to the beginning where you say, we want to pick a topic, a stakeholder or two who we know this is going to be a longer term relationship. It's a major goal. It's a major strategic imperative for this brand, for this group, for our company. And so really thinking through at the beginning allows you to move to consistent review and evaluation more easily at the end. And then, pivoting and adjusting, I think I've mentioned this 3 times, just because at any point here, you may have to pivot and adjust due to, again, changes in the environment, and also stakeholders change, right? You could get, partway through a project, and while they're willing to finish it, and you have the report and you have the health affairs article, they may have decided they're not willing to go to the Hill with you. And so understanding what that will mean. Do they have people who they work with who could go to the Hill with you? Are there other experts who have worked with health affairs in the past who are also experts in this area who would be willing to go to the Hill with you? Be prepared to have substitutes and to shift a little bit as needed right up until the end. And I think these are all things that we're used to some extent. But in this landscape, it's particularly important. And there's not a lot of, like the FDA isn't telling us how to do this. The HHS isn't telling us how to do this. The OIG hasn't weighed in. So you have flexibility from compliance, but you need to make good decisions that are ethical and obviously will pass legal scrutiny. Don't want to forget about that.
Great, thanks. Yeah, I know one of the things we really talked about with doing this and have been, as you said, working through legal scrutiny and all that is on the blue box, like developing relevant materials or strategies. So when I go back up to the wheel and I think about office staff or the patients, I think you can even do the kind of ecosystem mapping. You can use claims data and you can understand the patients going to a provider's office, what their ecosystem is, what's their level of education, what the HCP is working with, right? You can take it like to that whole other level of profiling offices and practices. So you've mapped them, you know who's important to them. You also know what issues their patients have, and then you can develop materials for those practices. I think that's like another level that you could take this to as well. And trying to get to specific materials in your marketplace. I know a lot of you on this that join work in market access. I see a lot of people that are like field reimbursement team members that either lead those or on this. I think that's like a way you could work with this too, is you understand kind of the office, how everyone's interrelated and what those challenges are that they're seeing. So I think you've got not only building out that map, but then honing in on those groups by each level and saying, okay, how do we engage with that HCP differently because of everyone talking to him? But also, what do we know about the patient groups in their area, or we know about the patients and their insurance coverage issues, or the payers that are influential in the area, and we can look at that and get very specific. So I think this is like the foundation for, as we go 5-10 years from now, right? What are we going to see? I think we're going to see some really customized outreach within some of those stakeholders that are direct on patient care. So I think it's really exciting. As I said earlier, I get very giddy talking about this because you see, oh, you can put the data here, you can learn this, you can do this. There's like 800 things everyone in pharma can do with it. And that's why you want to make sure, and again, I bring us up to my first point I made right at the beginning on you don't want to do this, right? You want to plan and, oh my gosh, sorry, my mouse is going crazy. You want to plan to know what you're doing at that step 1 and step 2, right? You don't want to try to boil the ocean and do too much, just like kind of your first step in ecosystem mapping, but you do want to have a plan to build on as you're getting more of that information and how you can move with it. Because I think there are a lot of ways you can use it, but you want to use it effectively. And we actually did get a question too that someone asked, like, what's a misstep with it? Like, what's something that can go wrong? I do think that could be something of either not getting alignment up front and like, what's the purpose of this? What are we doing with it? And like, what would be phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, phase 4, like to get to that really detailed, nuanced execution point versus some of that overarching thing. I think that is a pretty big misstep. And making sure that that's kind of what you're doing up front. I don't know, other panelists, if you guys have ideas, Andrea, Susan, or Tracy, on what could be some missteps with this as well.
I think that anytime you go outside your organization where you all are in some ways paid to be aligned, you take the risk that the person who you're trying to work with may not be as aligned. And so there needs to be an understanding that at the end of the day, if it's a study, if it's an article, there's only so much control you have over it, or there should only be so much control. And so, especially if you're working with like a patient group, or somebody that would be considered to be not on an equal footing with you as a company, you want to make sure that everybody involved, including, the head of the business unit, understands that there may be things that come out of this that aren't exactly what we asked for, and then really just be ready to kind of shape the end messages without completely discounting everything that you don't like as that's part of the study or the article. It can be tricky, but to have a fresh voice delivering a message that's important to you can far outweigh that, I think.
Okay, I have 2 more questions. One is, and I feel flattered, somebody asked if they could see our pictures. So I'm going to share that slide of our pictures. I was very, very proud of my hair that day. So thank you, whoever asked to see that. Appreciate it. I had a question come in too on what the, we've had some discussion around like different examples of using ecosystem. Just wondering, like, when to do it and which groups we think right now might be the most influential across the market access landscape. So I'm going to go to here. I would say it depends on when you're doing it, right? And your corporate life cycle and what your goals are. But I think, and maybe this is my slang because I've been doing this for 20 years in policy, but policy to me is health policy at the national level is getting crazier and crazier on the influential side, obviously in the payer and all of that. Would love to hear from the others on the panel as well. As, do you think there's specific wheel items that are more important? And do you think there's like a really good time for a company to consider doing this?
So first, sounds like my mom must be on this call if she's asking to see the pictures. So sorry about that. Mommy, stop doing that. So besides the pictures. But the second question, in terms of the influence, I do think it at some level, policy is going to be court because we are living in a healthcare system that where if the macro policy changes, it will impact every product in different ways. So I think I'm not going to say that's wrong, but I do also think it's about looking at the product in terms of your therapeutic area and what are your real core challenges. We're seeing a lot of work recently from a lot of our clients asking for this ecosystem mapping, but very much focused on the IDN world. Not saying who are the stakeholders who lead IDNs, but who are the influencers of the IDN, who are the kind of broader influencers. I think that's also because those are clients who have products that it's not the institutional level access is what's really driving their uptake and their commercial potential. They're seeing that the institution, they're doing all they can do with the United and the the Cignas and everything of the world, but the uptake is being stopped at the institution level, at the IDN and health system level, whether they're vaccines or primary care, and they're having this challenge at that institution level. So for those people and those clients and those therapeutic areas, those teams, institutional level is critically important. When you're talking about something like a rare disease, where some of the challenges are also the question of getting access from maybe potentially a higher pricing point than maybe a gene therapy within a rare disease or a smaller population, that patient advocacy, understanding that impact of engaging that patient advocacy to really build that story and share that story with FDA as well as payers, incredibly important. So there is a bit of it depends, but I would say really understanding what are the drivers and barriers, what do you think are going to, and within that prioritizing. Am I going to do all the great work at a macro level, but then be stuck because the IDN isn't capturing or I don't have patient advocacy support? Figure out that and then then prioritize based on that. And then earlier, I mean, we always say earlier the better, but think about those influence patterns and even our own influence networks here. You can't switch on those things in a month before launch, right? So at least a year or two prior to launch, you have to start building relationships in a organic way versus you waiting just to launch. So I think that's from the when perspective as early as possible.
Yeah.
And I would say actually just one other thing, in terms of who engages, we're seeing a mix of stakeholders. Sometimes it's reimbursement, it's policy teams, it's also medical affairs. Sometimes this information is being given to the medical affairs team because they may be able to engage with those people differently, or maybe a payer, reimbursement or a thought leader liaison. Sometimes we're seeing in other clients where the thought leader liaison is saying, taking all these different levels of influencers and being asked to engage with them. So who engages is another story that continues to evolve.
And we can even take it even a step earlier in the process, right? Even like understanding who the market is, right? There may be a large unmet need, but who's playing a role in the market? And so you want to start with the mapping early and also learn more about the market. Even what is the size of the market? In order to determine the size, you need to know the players. And very often there, again, you want to reach out early on to get input so that you're making the right assumptions. What defines, let's say there's no ICD-10 code out there. What defines the patient that has a particular disease? Again, you need some mapping done to identify those individuals as well and do that very, very early in the process.
Yeah, really good point. Great. Thank you all. Well, I know that we're coming up on the hour. Two housekeeping things. First of all, we always put these up on our website. So we'll post the webinar slides and the recording. So if anyone would like to see our faces in action or see our pictures again, you are welcome to do that. But they'll be up in just a few days. We do these every month. So next month, we're going to be talking about real world evidence in health technology assessments. And obviously it's got an ex-US side to it, but also how's that affecting what's going on in the world here now, right? We're starting to hear more and more about bringing those types of pricing metrics to the US. Are we kind of becoming HTA without meaning to become HTA? But I think there's some really cool stuff to talk about that. Again, would love to see people at Assembia. I have a home office. I'm lonely. Come to Las Vegas and hang out with us. But no, happy to talk about this more in depth. If you have any questions following the webinar, please feel free to reach out to us. You can do it through the website. And we appreciate everyone attending. Thanks, Andrea, Susan, and Tracy. And we'll see you all next month. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.